Do I hit continue? Hello, my name is Dave Hoke. My dear friend Mariah Reichert and I are in a consortium of sorts here at Yale to fill up some time. I'm just passing time, they're being intellectual. And we go around and take turns giving little presentations. I gave one on Mississippi Freedom Summer, 1964, originally known as the Summer Project. And Mariah asked if I'd do it again for some of her family, which is what we're doing tonight. But I happened to mention the talk in one of my far too many Facebook rants, and quite a few friends asked if I'd record it and show it for them. So that's what we're doing here now. A few very brief introductory remarks. I've been hesitant for years to say anything about race because it's a very delicate subject now. I don't mean I fail to recognize the racial crises in America, but the jargon. And I'm always flirting on the edge with the world of political correctness, showing my age. And I will spare you my adversarial relationship with certain aspects of political correctness, but that does segue necessarily into another point. In this discussion tonight, the N-word is going to arise. And after consultation with dear Mariah, I'm going to use it, never my choice, quoting others in historical context. You will see what I mean. You know, frankly, I'm going to tell you about people being beaten to death, bombed, shot, stabbed, jailed, imprisoned. So, you know, if you can take that, you'll probably be all right with a few mentions of the N-word. But I believe this is what's called, I forgot the name, Mariah, trigger warning, right? A trigger warning that the N-word will be said a few times. I don't take it lightly, but as this tale unfolds, you will see it doesn't really work without presenting things authentically. And finally, in that regard, this may be ill-placed confidence, but I am highly confident at the end of this roughly hour-long rap, you will know where I stand on the issues of race relations in America. So there you have it. All that said, Mississippi's Freedom Summer took place in 1964 between June and August. And before we get into the particulars, let us consider a few points about Mississippi. For example, what state has the most lynchings in American history? Wild guess? You've got it, Mississippi. Between 1882 and 1968, Mississippi had 539 recorded lynchings of Blacks. No doubt many more took place. As I've told friends for many, many years, I love the South and I particularly love Mississippi, but that state has a whole lot of karmic atoning to do. When we talk of the civil rights movement here, we're going to talk about what I call modern times, which begins with 1955, taking us back 65 years, which is plenty. But 1955, because of two incidents, is when the modern civil rights movement is generally considered to have begun. In August of that year, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who came to spend the summer with relatives in Money, Mississippi, a tiny little crossroads town, was strangled and mutilated for casually flirting with a white female store clerk. His head was bashed in, he was thrown in a river, and when his body surfaced and his mother found out about it and she took him home, and the funeral director said, of course, you don't want to display him, his face is so horrendous. She said, oh, I'm going to display him. And she did, and she invited Ebony Magazine then the #1 Black publication in the country, to come in and take photos of him in the casket. And it caused an international stir, causing some trouble for the state of Mississippi, but not nearly enough for them to change their ways. I deliberated at substantial length as to whether or not to show you the picture of Emmett in the casket, and I'm not going to. It feels gratuitous to me. There's no need to do it. You can find it all over the internet. It's terribly macabre. Coincidentally, John Lewis's funeral was today, and he made arrangements in the New York Times to have a final letter to America published in today's Times, in which he spoke of Emmett Till. Thank you, John. I'm going to read you the paragraph. This is just one paragraph. It's well worth reading his letter to the people, today's Time. But here's a relevant paragraph. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never, ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Very nice. That same year, just 4 months later in December, while this occurred in Alabama, it certainly shook the South and the nation, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. And Rosa begat the bus boycott begat Martin Luther King Jr., and the rest is now history. Those two incidents began the modern civil rights era. In April 1960, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called SNCC, SNCC, was born and spread throughout the South like kudzu. Unlike the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's group, and they worked together and had no problems. But Martin Luther King's group was more high profile in the larger Southern cities, and SNCC went right to the heart of the matter. They went right into rural communities. And so it is not surprising in 1961, SNCC began its first Black voter registration drive in Macomb, Mississippi. Conducting a Black voter registration drive in Macomb, Mississippi in 1961 is not good for one's health. So voter registration activities in Mississippi were organized under three groups: an umbrella organization called COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and SNCC. In reality, people working in and among those groups kind of, interchange between movement activity within the three groups. The first voter drive in 61 was headed up by a fellow named Bob Moses, who later coordinated Freedom Summer in 1964, which is the focus of this discussion. Moses started with SNCC, but as I said earlier, he flowed between the three, and his affiliation was indistinguishable, and it didn't matter. They were all in concert. He was assisted by many others, primarily Dave Dennis of CORE, who's a major player in Freedom Summer. More on Dave Dennis later. John Lewis, who was director of SNCC from 1963 to 1966, when he was replaced by Stokely Carmichael. More on Stokely Carmichael later as well. He was just all over Mississippi that summer, and another major player in Freedom Summer. Bob Moses was from Harlem. He's 85 now and kicking. I'll tell you what he's doing in a minute. And he went to school in upstate New York at a tiny little, almost all white conservative college called Hamilton, because they gave him a basketball scholarship. After he graduated, he went to Harvard and got a master's in philosophy. He had a full ride for a PhD in philosophy, but his mother became very ill and he dropped out after he got the master's and never had the chance to go back. became too involved with civil rights activism. While at Harvard, he became a devotee, if you will, of Albert Camus' political philosophy, and he followed his teachings throughout his life. Now, he runs something called the Algebra Project. He's kind of like the original STEM guy. After things died down with the civil rights movement in the South, Bob Moses said, you know, math is a civil rights issue. And everyone said, duh, huh? You gone bonkers? He said, no. The minority kids, especially the little black kids, are never going to get ahead because they don't know science. They're not being taught science. And the, if not separate, still separate and unequal schools, even though we supposedly ended segregation, which is, by the way, statistically worse now than it was in 1954 when the Brown versus the Board decision was handed down. But he said, we have to teach kids math. And he started the Algebra Project. And many years later, Dave Dennis, who again I'll say more about later, his sidekick throughout Freedom Summer, who later went on to Michigan Law School, Dave Dennis did, and became an attorney in the South, joined him in the Algebra Project. And now Dave Dennis is his assistant in that work and lives in South Carolina. To get a feel for the extent of racial tension and violence that preceded Freedom Summer, we must consider some other events. But before we do, Mariah, are we cool technologically? Okay, thank you. Because the racial tension in Mississippi could be cut with a knife. First things first, on September 30th, 1962, James Meredith, a black Air Force vet, was admitted to Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. There were riots, 2 deaths from shooting. Bobby Kennedy became neck deep in the negotiations with the governor at this time. But before Meredith's entry was successful, JFK, Bobby's brother, known as the President of the United States, had nationalized 10,000 National Guardsmen from Mississippi. That wasn't enough, and he had to bring in 20,000 regular Army troops to quell the riots. On June 12th, second event, on June 12th, 1963, JFK, he was late to coming to the necessity of civil rights involvement, but he gave a beautiful speech on civil rights that night. And later in the night, the Mississippi Field Secretary for the NAACP, Medgar Evers, and we don't have time to go into all this with Medgar Evers, who wasn't involved in Freedom Summer because he was dead. But Medgar Evers was a giant of a man, and I take this moment to give an aside because, as I said last night to Mariah, the people I'm talking about are names and statistics, so you get a better feel for them and their lives as we go on. But these were just giants. Their courage was staggering. The things they did was amazing. Southern Mississippi all of Mississippi during Freedom Summer was a war, except the Freedom Summer activists weren't allowed to have any guns because they were committed to nonviolence. And it took a heavy toll on them. But Medgar Evers was coming home a couple hours after JFK's speech from an NAACP meeting, and he was shot in the back in his driveway by Byron Della Beckwith, who went free for 30 years, and because of the incredible efforts of a Mississippi district attorney named Bobby DeLauder, in 1994 was convicted and served the rest of his life in jail. Bobby DeLauder was coaxed into doing this by Medgar's widow, Myrlie Evers, since remarried. So you had those 2 giant events. Then, although this was in Birmingham, it also rocked the South, the nation, and the world. On September 15th, 1963, 4 young black girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, which in those days was deservedly called Bombingham. Things were bad. So in the midst of this, Bob Moses, not a shrinking violet, proposed they have a serious summer project to register black voters. It became known as Mississippi Freedom Summer. And his idea was, if they kill a few black people, no big deal. Black people in Mississippi get killed every day. So let's bring in white volunteers for the northern colleges. First of all, they probably won't kill them. And secondly, it will make the violence down here much more visible to the nation. So they asked for volunteers. They got 700, and they trained them. I'll come back to the training in a moment. And they came down to work for Freedom Summer. We'll talk more about the training and whatnot in a moment, but I want to harken back for an instant to the amount of courage it took for people to go down there. A man named Jim Carrier wrote a wonderful book, Traveler's Guide to the Civil Rights Movement. He tells you all the towns in the South where things occurred. But in the book, he said the following: the Freedom Summer campaign of 1964, a voter registration drive led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, could be considered one of the most courageous human rights campaigns in history. Working virtually unaided, unprotected, and largely uncovered by the news media, young people walked door to door, persuading Black Mississippians to try at least to register and vote. Harassment was insidious and frightening, from economic strangulation to fire bombings. Backed eventually by slow-moving federal enforcement of new civil rights legislation, nearly 100,000 African Americans registered over the next 2 years and began electing Blacks to local, state, and federal offices. By the way, at the time of Freedom Summer, it was considered a failure. They only registered 12,000 people. But as Mr. Carrier just told us, in the following 2 years, 100,000 Blacks registered to vote, thanks in large part to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which we'll get to. And between 1963, I believe, and 1970, 800 Blacks were elected to public office in Mississippi. Unbelievable. True confession. I was 18 the summer of the Mississippi Project, and I really wanted to go, and I was a coward. And I'm not proud of it, and I should have gone. But I lived in North Florida in Gainesville, and I wish I'd gone, but so it goes. It was a very scary proposition, and I wasn't brave enough to go. I'm not proud of it, but that's the truth. Now, I was certainly involved in the civil rights movement, got beat up, got arrested, but nothing like Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer had 4 basic prongs or intentions. They were all aimed at bringing the violent severity of Mississippi racism to the national stage. Registration of Black voters, creation of freedom schools to teach Black children about racial history, which was not available to those who had public school education in Mississippi. They certainly taught no Black history there in the public schools. Creation of Black community centers, and to organize a Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, to challenge the seating of racist, all-white delegations to the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Everyone, of course, in the officially recognized Mississippi delegation was white, and announced in advance they were going to support Barry Goldwater. So they tried to replace them, and we'll get back to the story of Atlantic City later, and LBJ and the great, great, great civil rights activists Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer. Self-effacing though he was, Bob Moses definitely ran the show. He had the assistance of other key figures, as I said, Stokely Carmichael and Dave Dennis, and of course John Lewis, and many others. And I apologize to them. I just don't have the time to name everyone here. Stokely Carmichael, if you've not heard of him, is famous for 2 major things. He coined the term Black Power, and I'll tell you the moment he did it in a few minutes. And along with co-author Charles Hamilton, he wrote a book called Black Power. Can you see the name? I can't tell. Thank you. And in the book, they created and coined the term institutional racism. You know what Bill Barr insisted at to the House Committee, Judiciary Committee 2 days ago, doesn't exist. In the book, Black Power, Carmichael and Hamilton broached a question that is oh so relevant today. They were quite prescient when they wrote, and this is 1967 they wrote the book. Except that's the wrong quote. Sorry, here's the quote. Can a man condemn himself? Can whites, particularly liberal whites, condemn themselves? Can they stop blaming blacks and start blaming their own system? Are they capable of the shame which might become a revolutionary emotion? I think that's powerful and profound stuff, and so relevant today. It's a question 53 years later, white America must face up to if we're, we've passed the time for all the politicians to get up and say we need a conversation on race. We don't need a conversation on race. We need action on race and a healing on race, reconciliation and reparation. Now, in 1966, 2 years after Freedom Summer, after James Meredith, the guy I told you had trouble getting into Ole Miss, to put it mildly, graduated. He did graduate from Ole Miss in political science. He began a solo march he called the March Against Fear from northern Mississippi down to Jackson, which I'm sure is over 200 miles. James Meredith, and he's alive and well today, is a very interesting and unorthodox character. So when all kinds of civil rights activists, both white and black, said, oh, we'll march with you, he said, no, I'm marching alone. Mississippi being Mississippi, he was shot early on. He didn't die. I told you he's alive and well, but he went to the hospital for a couple of weeks. And Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael, along with many other black activists, took up the torch, said, we'll lead the march all the way to Jackson. And they did. And during that march, although they knew each other before, Stokely and Martin became very close friends. And actually, if you follow Martin Luther King's life closely, you're familiar with the legendary and crucially important speech he gave April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day before he was assassinated, in the Riverside Church in New York City, called Beyond Vietnam. And he just ripped the government for Vietnam. And Stokely Carmichael talked him into giving that speech. Stokely, by the way, later changed his name to Kwame Ture and moved to Guinea, where he died of cancer at age 57. But at night, they'd have rallies and talks, and the media is coming along, and curious onlookers were coming along. They had a pretty big crowd following him all the way to Jackson. And one night, feeling quite emotional, Stokely jumped on a car, started screaming. He is just so sick of this white oppression. And he raised his fist, and started screaming, Black power, I want black power. As far as anyone knows, that was the creation of that term. On the surface, Stokely was much more militant than Dr. King, but if you really read closely the life of Martin King after Malcolm was assassinated, Malcolm X, and Stokely, they all pretty much had the same message. But Martin Luther King had the advantage of having been accepted by the average white citizen. And after his death, they pablomed him down. He was a lion. He was a radical. He was a revolutionary. Go read his work from the last 3 years of his life. Astonishing. Anyway, Stokely was very charismatic and humorous. I'm going to read an excerpt from a speech he gave during Freedom Summer. Trigger warning, bunch of uses of the N-word in here. And seriously, if that offends you, I apologize, and I understand sensitivity of the term, but I just think when quoting from history, it should not be distorted. And I'm not going to distort it. Here goes. The story is actually humorous. Someone's talking about all the different events, Freedom Summer, and a guy chronicling it says, Wednesday night Stokely spoke at a very large mass meeting. He had been stopped by a well-known highway patrol goon, some miles north of here, and told the folks about his interview. The cop asked him how come some niggers always laugh and smile so much, hoping to make Stokely mad. How come some niggers sit on the porch? How come they drink so much and cut each other up? Stokely said, that's right, niggers drink too much, but they learned it from the white man. Niggers are lazy, and they learned that from the white man. Haven't you seen white folks sitting up on their porches? With Stokely talking about niggers all the time, the cop couldn't get him by using the word. And Stokely said, now we're learning from the white man about how to vote, baby. So they better watch out. Now, I hope you weren't deeply offended, but that just wouldn't have worked without telling the truth of it. Okay. By the way, the march from after Meredith got shot in 1966 was the last major civil rights march of the 60s. And that again was 2 years after Freedom Summer was born. So the volunteers, they needed to train them in nonviolence, and they'd send them through gauntlets, and the other people would not actually do it, but they would not go on the ground and scream and pretend they're beating them to get them used to what they sure as hell knew was going to happen in Mississippi. And they took them to train at the Western College for Women in Oxford, Ohio, which is now part of the Miami University of Ohio. Bob Moses was there, and he warned every volunteer very carefully, this is a dangerous mission, and there's no shame in backing out if you have reservations. Not one of the 700 backed out. They all went south. These people blow my mind. On the very first day of Freedom Summer, and you've heard this story, 3 volunteers, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner of New York, and James Chaney, a Black SNCC member working with Moses, very good friends with Moses, who was only 21. Moses wasn't, Chaney was, were kidnapped and murdered in what became the most sensational civil rights murder of the modern movement. I'll give you the story briefly. They really just wanted Schwerner. He had come down in January of 64 to work in the voting rights drive with Moses, knew him well, and he was working in Meridian, Mississippi, in Southeast Mississippi. And then he went back up to help with the training session where he met Chaney and Goodman from New York, Schwerner from New York, Chaney, local Mississippian. And they learned that a church had been burned, the Mount Zion Church in Longdale. And they went down to check out what happened at the church. And then they were driving, they were arrested, they were put in jail, they were let out at night. And Moses, in a prescient interview, had told someone before all this started, if they let someone out of jail at night, he's going to be killed. They let him out of jail. They followed them on a back road, chased them, stopped them, shot them all, killed them, buried their bodies in a bank by a dam. And they weren't discovered for something like 3 months. I wrote it down somewhere. I don't remember. The exact number of days doesn't matter. It was a long time. LBJ sent the FBI in. Prior to that, J. Edgar Hoover had said, no way the FBI is going in, being the virulent racist J. Edgar Hoover was. Oh, I'm forgetting the generation gap. J. Edgar Hoover was a longtime head of the FBI. And he'd wiretap and take photos of powerful politicians and then blackmail them to let them do what he wanted with the FBI. That's not hyperbolic, it's true. So eventually 18 people were charged. Now, they didn't even bother charging anyone in the Mississippi State Court with murder. Forget about it. It's going to be an immediate acquittal. So 18 were charged under federal civil rights statutes. The worst they can be charged for is conspiracy to violate someone's civil rights. And the largest penalty you can get is 10 years in jail and a certain fine. None of them had any money to pay the fine anyway. 7 of them were convicted. Several of them police officers, of course, no surprise. But 41 years later, 41 years after the murders, Edgar Ray Killen, one of the people in on the murdering, was found guilty of 3 counts of manslaughter and sentenced to 60 years in prison. 41 years later, they still couldn't sentence someone, convict someone of murder in a Mississippi state court, but they did convict him of manslaughter. Obviously, he's going to or has died in prison. But that summer was riddled with violence and mayhem by racist Mississippians. On a Wisconsin Historical Society document, pages 222 to 248, is a log of incidents that occurred during the summer. Let me just read a few incidents to give you a feel for it. And they documented every violent incident that occurred throughout the whole 3-month Freedom Summer. I'm just going to list 5 or 6 to give you a feel for the level of violence and the severity of the danger. June 16th, that's 5 days before it started. Zion Baptist Church burns to the ground. I just told you that. Fire starts after a Negro mass meeting. 3 Negroes were beaten by whites. The church was a Freedom School site. We'll come back to Freedom Schools in a minute. June 21st, in Rankin County, a Molotov cocktail explodes in the basement of the Sweet Rest Church of Christ Holiness. Fire, minor damage. June 23rd, Moss Point, Mississippi. Knights of Pythias Hall firebombed. Same night, Jackson, Mississippi. White car fires shot at Henderson's Cafe. Negroes pursue. 3 shots fired, hitting 1 Negro in the head twice. By the way, explanatory moment. Obviously, this was all written in the 60s, and the proper term, the respectful term, was Negroes, if you're wondering why I keep saying that while they're writing it. June 25th, Ruleville, home of Fannie Lou Hamer, who you'll be introduced to in a few moments. Williams Chapel firebombed. June 26th, Clinton, Mississippi, Church of Holy Ghost arson. You getting the idea? I don't need to go on. It's becoming cumulative evidence, as we say in a court of law. It's just staggering. It's just staggering, the violence. It really was an immensely violent project. And by summer's end, now PBS, I don't know if any of you know this, and as I always tell Mariah, I never mean to be disrespectful or condescending. I'm just so much older, 50 years older than my friends at Yale, and I don't know what they know, from history. So there was a very famous documentary about 15 years ago called Eyes on the Prize, a 9-part series on the entirety of the Civil Rights Movement. Magnificent. One whole episode was on Freedom Summer. And in it, the documentary claimed during the Freedom Summer, 3 volunteers have been murdered, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, but several others were Black locals. 80 people were beaten and 1,000, including local Black volunteers, have been arrested. I don't think so. I think it's an understatement. I think famed civil rights activist and another important Freedom Summer participant, Cleveland Sellers, who is a very famous civil rights activist. I met him at a large protest in St. Petersburg, Florida, 1969. And we had a long, wonderful talk. He was marvelous, brilliant. And 5 minutes after our talk, we went to the demonstration. The police rioted and beat the dickens out of us. How was that, Mariah? So Cleveland wrote a book called The River of No Return, and he gave his assessment of the degree of violence visited upon the volunteers. And here's a paragraph from Cleveland's book. It was the longest nightmare I have ever had. 3 months, June, July, and August of 1964. I was 19 years old, a man-child immersed in the seething core of the long, hot summer. These grim statistics relate only a small portion of the horror. 1,000 arrests, so they agreed with PBS on that. 35 shooting incidents, 30 homes and other buildings bombed, 35 churches burned, 80 beatings, they agreed on that too, but he says and at least 6 persons murdered. Although most of us managed to leave Mississippi, none of us escaped without terrible scars. I hope you're getting, I'm not the best spokesperson to deliver this message, but I hope you're getting a feel for the incredible enormity of this saga, this epic drama that unfolded, and the unfathomable courage of the people who voluntarily took part in it. So the question becomes, was it all worth it? Did the Summer Project accomplish its goals? In the broadest sense, yes. It brought Southern racial violence to nations and attention in a way it never had been before, other than Bull Connor's assault on Black teens in Birmingham the year before. Again, for my younger friends here listening, that was in Birmingham when they had the Children's Crusade and they marched in the streets, and the safety director, the head of the police, in other words, Bull Connor, unleashed dogs, brutally beat people, and you've probably seen videos of the fire hoses that tore their clothes off. Bull didn't win re-election, by the way. Yes, they only registered 12,000 voters, but I told you it opened the floodgates in the ensuing years. Still, in 2001, in a statewide referendum, the population of Mississippi voted by a margin of 2-1 to keep the Confederate battle flag as part of the state flag. Now that is finally gone, in large part due, of course, to the recent Black murders and the movement and Black Lives Matter, but also because of a very brave Mississippi athlete named Kylan Hill. Kylan Hill is a 20-year-old All-American running back at Mississippi State. And when all this went down, and the state legislature promptly said, we ain't taking down the flag, Kylan Hill held a press conference. No one knew he's doing it. None of his coaches, none of his teammates. And he very simply said, I don't know if anyone cares, but I'll never play another down for Mississippi State while that flag flies. And I think that played a major part in it. By the way, he was a psych major, so he used his schooling well. Of course, we have a long history of Black athletes fighting influentially for civil rights. Way back in the 50s, Bill Russell of the Celtics, 60s and 70s, the wonderful intellectual and Black Wimbledon champion Arthur Ashe, the great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and right now, Layshia Clarendon of the WNBA Women's Basketball League is taking this year off to work for social justice and giving beautiful speeches for Black Lives Matter. Now, in party politics, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party did not replace the racist delegation to the Democratic National Convention that August, thanks to the sabotage of LBJ, but it was the last fully segregated Mississippi delegation. In telling that story, which I'm about to, I think we'll start with 2 very short videos about that. One of them's 5 seconds long. So, Miss Mariah, I need you to turn me loose, my dear.
You should be good.
I'm ready to go. Thank you. Mr. Technology, I'm not, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Is this coming up? Well, we'll see. There we go. Okay, can you see this woman I'm pointing at?
Yep.
Okay, that's Fannie Lou Hamer. Wonderful woman from Ruleville, which is, believe it or not, in Sunflower County, Mississippi. So involved with the voter registration drive. And first I'm going to show you the 5 most famous seconds of her life. Well, I need to give you some context. They wouldn't seat them. All the liberal Democratic white people who said, we'll support you to the end, bailed on them. LBJ offered them 2 delegates, which ultimately they took because they weren't going to get any. it started knocking down the doors, but they considered their effort a total failure, which was not being fair to themselves. And she got up and spoke about 20 minutes on live national TV and caused such a stir. LBJ had the networks interrupt her speech to go up and talk about nothing till she was done. But it backfired because all the three, we only had three networks then, ABC, CBS, and NBC. They all just played her whole speech later that night on their TV news. But she's most famous for saying this, and you've probably heard it. This really is 5 seconds.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Now, if you're going to do one line, that's a pretty damn good one. Here's a 2-minute thing on the fight at the conference. 3 minutes.
This little light of mine.
The testimony before the Credentials Committee, the FDP had a lineup of very different people. They had Rita Schwerner, the widow of Nicky, who had been killed in Neshoba County. They had Martin Luther King, everybody knew King.
The seating of the delegation from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as political and moral success far beyond the borders of Mississippi for the whole of this convention.
But the highlight of the testimony was that of Fannie Lou Hamer, the sharecropper who had been evicted from a plantation had come to symbolize the Mississippi movement.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee. It was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola with...
Sorry, I don't know where that noise is coming
The
from.
president, Lyndon Johnson,
From the other YouTube video you have open, Dave.
afraid of
Time out. Why don't we just pause it for a second, all right?
Yep. And then if you go to that last tab that you had open right next to it up top. There you go. Close that and then it should be better.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. No worries.
We still got 2 minutes.
Hamer's testimony. And so he decides that the country should not see her testifying live.
This is Bob Moses.
Johnson is in the White House, and he convened an impromptu press conference.
We'll return to this scene in Atlantic City, but now we switch to the White House and NBC's Robert Borowski. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. On this day, 9 months ago.
He did it knowing that they would break away, thinking he might announce who his choice of vice president was going to be. Instead, he gets up there and he announces, get this, he announces that it's 9 months to the day since Governor Connolly, who was there, was shot along with President Kennedy. So he announced a 9-month anniversary. Everybody's scratching their heads.
Thank you very much.
And then he leaves. By that time, Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony was over. However, it backfired on Johnson because it became a story that she had been taken off television and in the news that night, and for days afterwards, they replayed her testimony.
I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cell.
She had Mississippi in her bones. Martin Luther King or the SNCC field secretaries, they couldn't do what Fannie Lou Hamer did. They couldn't be a sharecropper and express what it meant, right? And that's what Fannie Lou Hamer did.
And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was State Highway Patrol. He said, "We're going to make you wish you were dead."
Okay, I'm coming out of share. And I'm gonna have to go back in share, all right, Mariah? Not yet, but
You should close that YouTube video window though so it doesn't autoplay another video while you're trying to talk.
Oh, it's going to. Thank you. She has all the moves. Wouldn't get through this program without her. And everyone laughs, but she and I know that's true. Okay. Also, heavily involved in helping them was the legendary civil rights activist Ella Baker. I don't have time to go into Ella Baker's life now. Just another towering giant in America. It is such a shame, even now, we just don't do justice to Black history in our schools. They're starting to at some of the better universities, but these people are incredible. These people are incredible. So they went up there, they got, how do I euphemistically put this? Shafted, that word will work. They got shafted. They were just disgusted. They correctly felt they'd been betrayed by the white liberals. And it was a bad time. But out of Freedom Summers' national exposure came the Civil Rights Act. In fact, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law July 2nd by LBJ at the end of in the middle of the second week of the Freedom Summer. And he did that, of course, to get attention, riding on the shoulders of the brave people working on the registration project. But also out of that came the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It pains me to not give you a long lecture on this because I think it's the most important Supreme Court issue in maybe since Brown versus Board. Certainly the most important civil rights issue since Brown versus Board, which was 1954. And this case called Shelby County versus Holder, 2013. So for 59 years. So what happened was the Civil Rights Act passed in 65, the Voting Rights Act said communities suspect of previous racist conduct and not allowing people to vote must get federal, what's called pre-clearance. And there was a long list of communities, some in the North, but almost exclusively in the South. And it kept being challenged. And finally, in 2013, in Shelby County versus Holder, John Roberts was the swing vote, going with the other four conservatives, that struck down that act, saying, this law was passed so long ago, those counties don't really have serious racial prejudice like they used to. And if you think we're wrong, you can change the law back. Now, what he meant by that was, just one more moment on constitutional law. If the Supreme Court issues an opinion on something to do with the Constitution, does this come under the 14th Amendment? Is that equal protection? Blah, blah, blah. Do you have a right to bear arms under the Second Amendment? When they give an edict, an opinion, a decision, a holding, that's it. But when they give an opinion that interprets a federal statute, that is something Congress can change. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, important though it was, 1965, important though it was, it's just a federal statute. So Congress can change it. Why do I bore you with this? To bring us up to the immediacy of the moment. It is crucial we not only win the presidency, but the Senate. As soon as we win the Senate in November, and we will, and yes, I'm not naive. No, I'm not naive. Surely anyone who knows me knows I am well aware of the extent of voter suppression in America. I've been studying for many years. I'm not bragging, but I don't come to this issue in a cavalier way. I'm not a dilettante on voter suppression. And the same with his attempts to steal the election. If you haven't heard today's news yet, this very day, Mr. Trump tweeted that there'll be so much fraud with mail-in voting, perhaps we should call off the election. Delay the election, triple question mark. So I'm aware he's going to try and steal it. but he's not going to because he's so reviled and he keeps digging his own electoral grave deeper with every utterance out of his mendacious mouth. So it is crucial we win back the Senate, and then one of the first orders of business will be to change the Voting Rights Act, simply by doing this, and I promise this will not be technical. Roberts said it no longer measures properly. They'll just bring up all the statistics where racist voter suppression is still taking place. They'll have current data. They'll draw the boundaries of who has to get pre-clearance from the new data. Bang. The Voting Rights Act will be back in force. Let us pray. It's the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2021. Okay, excuse my rant on that. It's just terribly important. And all that, starting with the Voting Rights Act of 65, came out of Freedom Summer. As for the Freedom Schools, they were intended to teach Black history to kids and the ABCs and reading, writing, arithmetic. These kids in rural Mississippi who were sharecroppers' children, who rarely went to school because they're helping their parents get in the cotton, were not exactly steeped in Black history. Why should they be? White college graduates weren't either. So the schools were a big hit, and a whole lot of the people who studied and were taught there went on with the assistance and letters of recommendation, support, and guidance of the volunteer kids who taught them in the Freedom Schools to college and wonderful careers of their own. And it was a beautiful thing. Of course, Freedom Schools were bombed all the time. If they didn't kill anyone, but if they did, so what? What do they care? I want to briefly read, and I know I'm really running long, but let me go back to Mariah. Can I go 10 more minutes? You sure? Okay, thanks. Okay. I want to read a few letters. Tell me if you can see this. It's a book called Letters from Mississippi. Thank you. I want to read just short passages from a few of the letters. One young man is writing, these are all written by the white volunteers from the North. He's writing of how polite and respectful, to the point of making him feel awkward, the wonderful Black citizens of rural Mississippi are to them. There are the old men and women in old clothing whom you know have little money and none to spare, who stop you as you are leaving the church after addressing the congregation and press $1 into your hand and say, I've waited 80 years for you to come, and I just have to give you this little bit to let you all know how much we appreciate your coming. I praise for your safety every night, son. God bless you all. And then they move down the stone steps and disappear along the red clay road lined with tall green trees and houses tumbling down. Another letter talks about the death of a civil rights worker involved with the registration project, voter registration, named Herbert Lee. Herbert Lee was just walked up to in public, shot in the head and killed. No charges were brought. There have been so many things that have never made any difference because no one's heard of them. Like the Negro Herbert Lee, who was shot on the front lawn of the Liberty Courthouse 3 years ago by a member of the state legislature. And then it goes on about what happened. They did nothing. By the way, Lee's wife, a very heavy moment, understandable though, came up to Bob Moses and started screeching at him, you had my husband killed, you had my husband killed. And Moses has said many times he never got over it. One more thing about the bomb, the degree of violence. This was written by a white volunteer who was stationed in Moss Point, Mississippi on Monday, July 6th. He wrote it on Monday, July 6th, 1964. Tonight the sickness struck. At our mass meeting, as we were singing We Shall Overcome, a girl was shot in the side and in the chest. We fell to the floor in deathly fear, but soon we recovered and began moving out of the hall to see what had happened. When I went out, I saw a woman lying on the ground, clutching her stomach. She was so still and looked like a statue with a tranquil smile on her face. I ran to call an ambulance and police. It seemed as though a signal had been given. 2 days later, the project headquarters in Macomb was bombed. On Friday, a Molotov cocktail was thrown at the Freedom House in Canton. In Hattiesburg, a visiting rabbi and 2 volunteers are severely beaten. I'm going to show you the rabbi's picture after he was beaten in a moment. On Saturday night, the Shaw Project workers learned of a bombing plot as whites surrounded their office. The next day in beautiful old Natchez, a Baptist and a Methodist church were destroyed by fire. 2 of 5 Negro churches burned to the ground this week. The white folk weren't kidding around. I'm going to show you some pictures now. May I take it back right now? Thank you. I'm going to show you pictures and one more little video of Dave Dennis that's extraordinary, and it's only about 2 minutes long. Oh, I have to go back in. I forgot. I hope I'm back in.
You're good.
You see Fannie Lou Hamer again?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Let's go to the top. This will just take a couple minutes. This is from 62, September 30th, when they're first trying to bring James Meredith into Ole Miss. These are people there to heckle him. Can you see that picture okay? And to give you a better size of the crowd, remember, they brought in 10,000 National Guards and 20,000 U.S. troopers, U.S. military troopers. This is Martin Luther King holding up the photo of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman getting killed. By the way, Schwerner's family, his wife, Rita Schwerner, who became a lifelong activist in civil rights and is an attorney in Seattle, she and remarried about 5 or 10 years later. She and Mickey Schwerner's parents asked him to be buried alongside James Chaney, the Black Mississippian who was killed. And the state of Mississippi wouldn't let a black and white be buried together. You can't read it, but here's a plaque to the 3 of them on the side of the road where they were murdered. Now, Dave Dennis, I've told you a bunch about. Dave Dennis was asked to speak at James Chaney's funeral, which was in Meridian. And he got up to speak and they gave him very strict directions. Don't rock the boat. This is a rough time. Just give a typical little eulogy and get out. So watch what he did. I love Dave Dennis. Where is it? Oh, where is it? There it is.
Loading. Yeah, there you go.
I was horrified. Can you see him? Okay. Watch what he did when they told him don't rock the boat.
In Mississippi, a memorial service was held for James Chaney.
The decision had been made by family members and local leaders and others that they want to keep this very quiet and then low key, rather, to their eulogy.
I want to talk about is really what I really grieve about. I don't grieve for Chaney because the fact I feel that he lived full of life that many of us would ever live. I feel that he's gotten his freedom. We're still fighting for it.
Dave Dennis's speech was a turning point in the summer because everybody wanted him to say the usual things that you would say at a funeral. And Dave Dennis just couldn't do it. He challenged the people at the memorial, and he challenged the whole movement.
You see, we all tired. You see, I know what's going to happen. I feel it deep in my heart when they find the people who killed those guys in Neshoba County.
All the different emotions, things that have been going through leading up to this particular moment began to come out, boil up, and we might call this. And looking out there and seeing Ben Chaney, James Chaney's little brother, I lost it. I totally just lost it.
Don't bow down anymore. Hold your head, sir? You want our freedom now. I don't want to have to go to another memorial. Tired of funerals. Tired of it. Got to stand up.
He's something, isn't he? Oh, I should kill this or others will come up. Okay, a few more pictures and a few more words and I'll be done. Here's just a protester getting arrested, and as I explained to Mariah last night, I put this up because of the incongruity. Almost all the photos of protesters getting arrested show them getting beaten and dragged through the streets. Does anyone, here's a quiz. Does anyone know who this cat is? John Lewis with hair. Fannie Lou Hamer. You've seen this stuff. This is just a random picture of a volunteer working with people in the community. This is Bob Moses. Stokely Carmichael, the great Stokely Carmichael. Just some kids at Freedom School playing out the window. This is the rabbi who was beaten pretty badly. And I think, yes, I have one more 2-minute video. And I'll say a few wrap-up words.
I don't want the nigger as I have known him and contacted him during my lifetime to control the making of the law that controls me, to control the government under which I live.
I don't think people understand how violent Mississippi was. If Black people try and vote, they can get hurt or killed.
You're not a registered voter, you're not a first-class citizen.
They would say, "You're right, boy. We should be registered to vote." I ain't going down there and mess with them white people.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 students from all around the country who will engage in Freedom School, voter registration activities, and open up Mississippi to the country.
We face absolute extinction of all we hold dear. We must be strong enough to face the enemy.
Civil rights workers who disappeared in Mississippi last Sunday night still have not been heard from.
It was always in the back of everybody's mind that bad things were going to happen. But if you cared about this country and you cared about democracy, then you had to go down.
So let me kill that. Very good. And let me come out of share. All right, am I back? Thank you. And it just, I want to say 2 quick things about that video. When you're hearing the debates about the Confederate flag, did the 9 million Confederate flags you've seen in these videos and photographs tonight strike you as pride and heritage or vicious racism? Not a hard question. And secondly, the man who was laughing, the guy about my age who was laughing with the beard stubble and said, yeah, we should register, and I'm not going down there with the white folk. His name's Charlie Cobb, and he was a very close friend of Moses, and they wrote a book together, and he was neck deep in it too. I want to give Charlie Cobb credit. Okay. So it just was an amazing time. It was the best of my generation. I was involved in both the civil rights and anti-Vietnam movements. I'm proud of both efforts. but it took more courage, even for white people, to march for civil rights in the 60s. And looking back, I should have done more with civil rights. I did my duty, but should have done more. And now the chickens have come home to roost because America's racism and misogynistic sexism is finally being challenged. And if we're going to be saved from fascism this November, it'll be Black women who save us. I say God bless them. In closing, and this is the closing, honestly, I want to give you a visceral feel for the zeitgeist of the time. So I've set my ego aside, by which I mean I used to sing a little, and you hear how raspy my voice is talking. Imagine me singing. You're not going to have to imagine, you're going to hear it in a minute. It's just horrible. But I took out my little guitar, my little harmonica, and I made a simple little short recording of the anthem of the times, which, as one of the videos told us, is the song We Shall Overcome. And I just sang 4 verses. I'm sure there are 20 or more verses. These days it's considered almost a Thomas song, but it really was the anthem. And so I'm going to close with this. And again, try and not, think of my singing as talking. Ready? Mariah, we ready?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. Here we go. It gives you a feel for what it was like to be alive and involved then. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Ah, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Ah, deep in my heart, I do believe we'll walk hand in hand someday. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Ah, deep in my heart, I believe we are not afraid today. Be free. We will all be free. We will all be free someday. Ah, deep in my heart, I do believe we will all be free someday. Thank you. You're very kind. That song just works for me, and Just playing that song tells the whole story. So you've been very kind and patient. I'm so grateful you let me make this presentation to you. And I really hope it was worth your while and that you learned something. And I am, of course, open to any and all questions you may have.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording. Is that okay?
Unless people have questions they want to get on there.
Anyone have questions they need on the recording? I don't think. All right. Any last comments you want before I
Yes,
stop
yes,
recording?
yes. To my friends who'll see this later, I hope I passed the audition. Thank you. And dump Trump. Thank you.